dollar, that's what I need. And if I share with you my story, would you share your dollar with me? Bad times are coming and
Particles of hope float from high, like bits of water paper unraveling the sky. Listening to trees who speak, ancestors who live in rocks that teach, looking sideways at settler hideaways who claim to acknowledge genocide while in settler college with protected archives. An arching marble, but no intent to address real sorrow, a reckoning of reparations or a social justice statement. Overpriced dorms or permanently open doors for millions who struggle with the lie of rent, the insane focus on how much blood-stained dollars can be spent, using radical, sexy words like settler futurity resisted with housing security. Can these academic spaces from New York to the island nations become more than a beautiful sounding conversation, but an actual agreement to land back liberation, to stopping the violent gentrification, to listening to poor people's scholarship and lifting up and activating community reparations? Yeah, so today's podcast from a poverty scholar is dedicated to all my brothers and sisters in struggle for $1 who have tried to stay in their housing in the face of Akkkademik colonization and are now joining the sad and effed up place I call the unhoused nation. The role of academia, or what I like to call Akkkademia, in this violent homelessness, gentrification, and land theft. Best believe, family, it's way more than I can say today. From Berkeley to NYC and beyond, the settler violence of private property in the capitalist system unhouses youth, families, grandmothers, aunties, uncles, and countless disabled black, brown, and poor white and indigenous peoples. Eviction, gentrifuking, rent increases, housing shortage, job loss, underemployment, polarized profiling, incarceration nation, trauma, domestic violence, and so much more are also triggers. We have done countless research, that's poor people-led research projects, connecting the dots to all these capitalist systems that put out our folks on these stolen streets, leading us into a vicious cycle of homelessness. Connecting the dots in so many ways. As well, evictions is elder and child abuse. More research by Poor Magazine continue to be perpetrated. Shouts out to Denis Donis, an indigenous elder being evicted right now by the lie of private property in occupied Lamu, Frisco. Not to mention RAD and No Hope 6. Shouts out to United Front Against Displacement and many more, as well as Poor Magazine that have been fighting that benignly titled gentrifucking of the last form of poor people housing we had. And most recently, the lie of the eviction moratorium and how it was there for a minute, didn't even cover everybody, and then went away into more capitalist lies of eviction. All of these terrifying realities, in addition to the overarching violence of capitalism itself, indigenous land theft, black land theft, and just a white supremacist nation, it's a wonder anyone is housed. And overstandably, so many of us are now members of the ever-growing violent nation called the unhoused. I barely survived the violence of that homelessness and poverty with my mom in the streets of LA Berkeley, Frisco, and Oakland. And it's one of the reasons that I work so hard to lift up these stories, to lift up the stories that people would rather not think about when they're thinking about their profit margins and their property values and their income property and all the other lies that is specifically pandered to working class people as a way to get out of poverty and is a constant source of stolen wealth for wealth hoarders. But one driver of increased removal and displacement is rarely, if ever, discussed, mentioned, or named. It's Akkkademia, family, and it's a different kind of game. It's the ever-hungry dorm industrial complex, which this poverty scholar has talked about before on this podcast. Specifically, the cult of angst and subsequent separating of children from their families and communities enables the other crucial lesson of Akkkademia, the lesson of individualism, individuation, selfishness, self-centered actions, and produces the perfect capitalist consumer with all the elements of a future gentriFUKer and IKEA shopper, a mobile workforce, the upwardly mobile, all the other lies of capitalism to separate us from everything that makes us, produces people who become complicit in the age separation, ghettoizing their own elders in homes and children in age-separated schools and so-called boarding care homes, all so that we don't have to take care of our own elders. We don't have to deal with the messy and grumpy people who raised us, who gave us life. Yeah, I call all this the dorm industrial complex. And what you just heard was an excerpt of page 172 of chapter 6 of Poverty Scholarship, Poor People-Led Research, Education, and Tears Across Mama Earth. Now, I call it the dorm industrial complex because it's rooted in the cult of angst. Of course, these are things that I teach in People School, which is, by the way, is coming up in Black August 27th and 28th. Y'all should register, fam. It's on Zoom, and it might even be in person. The cult of angst is a specific paradox and disease inherent in the buying and selling of Mama Earth and Akkkademia to function. Academic institutions from Berkeley to Temple University, from San Francisco to Cal State LA and UCLA, continue the land theft of the original colonizers, which, incidentally, many of the buildings on their campuses are named after expansion, land theft, removal, and violent gentriFUKers under the guise of student housing, which is really a cover for a giant pyramid scheme that's, I call the Away Nation. Again, I outline these in Chapter 6 of Poverty Scholarship textbook and our sessions of the degentrification, decolonization workshop at People School. But a recent aspect of the ever-increasing academic colonization is what I'm calling academic apartheid. Yeah, straight up. These institutions aren't building student housing for all students. They're building luxury student housing, which means the only students who will be housed in this 21st century model is the children of wealth hoarders, which means that this violent gentrifucking is focused on housing students with resources. And nowadays, it leaves poor students houseless. Luxury housing for college and university students across the U.S. has become a multi-billion-dollar industry for universities, with apartment buildings featuring pools, clubhouses, spin studios, while poor and working class students, like Max, one of our Poor Magazine members, ends up houseless on the street while trying to go to school. Some students get a housing stipend as part of their financial aid, but it only covers the cost of dorms or less expensive off-campus housing. And the only way that students can live in these places is by agreeing to work in them in exchange for discounted or even free rent. Currently, there's at least one class action suit alleging that this has essentially made them the equivalent of indentured servants to their wealthier classmates. Meanwhile, back at Akkkademia, Columbia University, the Manhattanville Project, and black land theft. So Columbia University, known as one of the big, wonderful universities back east in occupied Lenape, has an extensive history of evicting black and brown and poor tenants to make way for their ever-expanding campus. The fight and resistance of tenants fighting this institution spanned decades and actually was rooted in a neighborhood called Morningside Heights, which our stolen land hoarded resources untour visited on a recent untour to occupied Lenape through Akkkademia, Columbia. Not to mention the fact that at the end of it, Columbia University actually physically removed students and families from an entire neighborhood, made them houseless so that they could build this dorm and these dorms for these students. Meanwhile, back at the occupied village of Uchin, aka hip-hop-crazy Berkeley, we have People's Park. Shouts out to Aiden Hill, to June, to so many more, Ocean Newman, to Michael Delacourt, who have lost their lives behind this lie, who have lost their lives, their homes, their tents behind this notion of so-called dorm housing. At the end of the day, it's really important for people to understand and overstand that whether it be dorms or whether it be buildings named after eugenicists, academia isn't complicit in the stealing and the gentrifucking of neighborhoods. Again, shout out to 1921 Walnut Street in Berkeley, a building of over 100 tenants, mostly elders, disabled, many black and brown, who had lived there for decades, were evicted so that they could build a luxury dorm for the UC Berkeley students. These were rent-controlled tenants. At the end of the day, again, shouts out to Defend People's Park, to Columbia University Housing Equity Club, and to all the warriors fighting the endless and violent removal for something that's not necessary. Because as I teach in People School, why are you leaving the people who gave you everything that enabled you even to go to school? These are lies of capitalism that are taught you, and so that you don't even know they're happening. And the answer isn't as simple as rejecting academia. I think people who got that paper should get that paper and give it back to their communities. But you don't need to leave home. And if your home is not safe, I'm not speaking to you right now. If your home is not safe, you don't need to go to the dorm industrial complex and become part of the gentrification nation just to go to school. I appreciate you all. Think about People School. Black August 27th to 28th. Go to www.racepovertymediajustice.org.
That's what I need. Well, I need dollar.